So, do you remember back a while, just 2 or 3 years ago, when Epic Games released a video that went viral in combination with a campaign essentially calling out Apple for being monopolists in a spoof of their 1984 version commercial. It was very effective, so much so that now we have a group of other companies, let's call them, that are starting to come around to that same thought process. In fact, there's actually a growing list of apps and companies that, at least the companies that operate those apps, that are starting to vent their spleen at how Apple is handling purchases inside of their apps, these companies' apps, and of course, any of the other product offerings that they have. This is actually only going to grow over time, this discontent, and I think it will lead to a greater amount of scrutiny. Let's dive into this very juicy story. Here we go. So if you have an iOS device, you live in the most protected walled garden imaginable. The outside world may not even exist as far as you're concerned, at least within your phone or your iPad or your computer, of course. Now that sounds hyperbolic, but actually it really isn't. In fact, everything that exists within your iPhone, or again, as I mentioned, the similar products, has to pass muster with Apple before they can hand them out. Every app is put through the same testing and benchmarking, and they make sure that they can guarantee your security and, some other things like near flawless operation and Apple's own monitoring. Or at least so Apple says, or doesn't say, because it's not very explicit outside of the fact that every company has to go through a fairly rigorous process. Now, what Apple really wants is to control their entire ecosystem from top to bottom, with really no room for anything else or anyone else or any app else, I don't know how else to say it, intruding or treading on that territory. Why? Well, because the App Store. See, the App Store is the king of revenue for Apple. So much so that this fact was actually put on display by Apple. They're very proud of this. They reported in January of this year, 2022, that in 2021, they paid out $60 billion to developers just that year. This humble brag was, of course, also targeted at investors in Apple, because they essentially were presenting themselves as very profitable, because as everybody knows who invests in Apple, they skim 30% right off the top of all of those purchases, anything that any of these entities earn, at least the big ones. And, that's a lot of money. Well, that 30%, of course, is in most cases, because small businesses that basically have less than $1 million in app sales per year are actually paying a reduced commission of 15%. That's little solace to, of course, the big boys who are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year through the iOS devices. Now, there was a suit that was filed, and a countersuit filed between Apple and Epic. And that actually brought to light some interesting things, like 70% of App Store revenue is brought to Apple, courtesy of only about 10% of the apps, because the majority of the apps on the platform are free. And let me tell you, the majority of that revenue, if not all of it, comes from games, like the things that Epic offers. And some of it comes from music, some of it comes from books, but most of it comes from games. So with all this background now, we're going to dive a little deeper into what's going on with some of these new contestants here in the Monopoly Wars. And it's actually easy to understand why Epic and these others are trying to collect the fruits of their labor outside of the Apple ecosystem, because that's essentially what Epic wanted to do, to circumvent having to pay a commission on something that a customer has already acquired via the App Store. Makes sense, right? So we're going to add to this fight Spotify. That's right. Spotify also is bringing some folks with them, like TikTok and Meta and Snap. They're all starting to align against Apple's iron-fisted control of this app store. Because let me tell you, it's the perfect walled garden, as I mentioned before. And Spotify has recently been cited extensively in this article that I have here from The Hollywood Reporter. Now, the person speaking here is Nir Zeikerman, who's over there at Spotify, openly admitting that they painstakingly developed a set of workarounds for its new audiobooks unit. And again, this was specifically done in an effort to avoid sharing that revenue with Apple's collection of their 30% off the top skim. And the solution required users to jump through hoops, utilizing some external links to buy the book that way. And Apple was okay with that because as far as they were concerned, that's all well and fine as the service was starting to be rolled out, which happened in September. But that arrangement actually didn't last very long. It went sour fairly quickly. And so with recent updates, Apple reversed course on them, probably without a whole lot of notice. And that actually now leads any customers that are interested in purchasing these audiobooks through Spotify with no ability to do so. They essentially hit a virtual brick wall. And of course, there's good reason for Spotify to be upset here because they actually worked with Apple on this background process to begin with. What we've also learned is this isn't new for Spotify. They've been very upset for a very long time with Apple, but it's been pretty quiet. In fact, they went about attacking Apple through an antitrust complaint against the company via the EU because they operate outside of the United States. And this complaint was lodged in 2019. And last year, the commission that was investigating this EU antitrust complaint issued a statement of objections, which means they found some difficulty with what Apple was doing. And they said explicitly that Apple had distorted competition in the music streaming marketplace, and as such, it abused its dominant position for distribution of music streaming apps through its app store. Right, because they want you to buy from them. And if you don't, you're going to pay a service charge of 30% of your revenue. But Spotify is not the only voice being heard now because Meta has entered the chat. With the recent changes in data management and control that have been instituted by Apple, Meta has lost valuable insight and the ability to market to a huge subscriber base utilizing iOS devices. Why? Well, because of some privacy features that limit data that Facebook can collect, which sounds like a good thing, but maybe not, because it's not like Apple doesn't collect that information anyway. This is coming at a time when all of these big tech ad-supported platforms are desperate for digital advertising revenue because of the strong economic headwinds that we're facing with the economic downturn that we've been in for months now. By Meta's estimates, they're actually losing about $10 billion in revenue as a result. And I believe that's every single year. Maybe next year would have been bigger. We don't know. But we already know what this has done to Meta, the parent company of Facebook, already, because the overall value of Meta has, dropped precipitously. It's also led to speculation about its future outlook, which is rather dim. And that's crazy for a company that was worth several $100 billion not that long ago. In fact, if you look at Meta, Snap, Twitter, TikTok, all of those have been affected by the recent changes with Apple, not just because of the privacy stuff, but because of that walled garden. And all of those effects have been negative, at least for those companies. So when asked about acquiescing to the 30% take that is required by Apple, Spotify's Zeikerman, who we spoke about just a moment ago, says that it is a non-starter economically. They can't do it. And it's easy to see that point because it ruins profitability by hammering the margins that make these services viable. So at the current rate, there's no profit if they just eat that 30%. And of course, if they raise the prices for these audiobooks, that's going to, well, turn consumers off and drive down sales because it's too expensive. So either way, and I think this is correct, it's a lose-lose proposition for everybody involved. Well, and specifically for the people at Spotify. I fully expect that all these entities are going to come together collectively to pursue some litigation against Apple. And it's high time they actually did. Maybe that combined effort, along with, let's say, Epic, will allow them to make some headway this time and actually get something done. It's easy to argue that business conducted outside of the ecosystem should not be subjected to Apple's policies. Of course, make that argument against any of the TOS services you and I use daily, and you see the fact that you're kind of locked in. Maybe not legally, not as tight as they would like you to be, but there's a lot of legal language in there that makes them feel happy anyway. It's also easy to argue that Apple has no right to lock down the system the way that they have. And I'm speaking specifically about the Apple App Store as a whole. Now, the irony here that's not lost on me as we wrap up this video here today is that all of these companies that are complaining about this are equally guilty of monopolistic practices themselves. So perhaps this is an object lesson that could be learned by all and applied to all. Or perhaps not. Maybe that's a little too pie in the sky. Regardless, what do you think? Do you think that Spotify and others have a case for pursuing their sales outside of the Apple's walled garden ecosystem? Do you think that Apple needs to make their walled garden a little bit more accessible? Isn't there room for a little bit more transparency here? Isn't that something we all ask for? And do these companies all need to start playing fairly with each other and, of course, with all of us? Good questions, all, and hopefully we can have a conversation about them down in the comments section below. And with that, I'll say the same thing that I always say. Be sure to support independent creators here on any of the platforms you're seeing me on right now. Be sure to like, subscribe, follow, whatever it is that you see that you can do to, encourage growth for those channels, which not least of which is to comment, because comments do drive growth on any of these algorithmically driven platforms. And with that, be sure to take care of yourself, take care of others, wash your hands, of course, because it's good hygiene. And until next time, bye. And don't forget to check out my Rumble at rumble.com/CultureCasino.
Thanks for visiting today. Be sure you're subscribed and hit that for alerts.
Yay!
Of course, like and share all of the videos that you can as it helps with the algorithm. Have a great day.